Welcome to Jared Scott Outdoors, your source in the field for local outdoor news. At the start of Nate's muzzleloader deer hunt, we found some bucks, but had a tough time finding a big one. There were a couple nice ones that Nathan decided to go for, even though they weren't quite what he was looking for, but in each case, the buck got away, and Nathan still hadn't notched his tag. Now with the season nearly over, just after Thanksgiving, we headed back out. As you'll notice, Nate's loading his gun once more. That's because at first light, we'd spotted a great looking buck, the kind that you know right off as a shooter. It was a long ways off, and so we didn't even worry about filming it. We just packed our gear and started heading up the mountain. Of course, to keep hidden, we went up the opposite side of the ridge that we had seen the buck on. It was with a bunch of does, and they were feeding further up. However, these deer were a long ways up. In fact, it was well over 1,000 feet in elevation gain to get to them. We pushed it hard in order to get there while the deer were still feeding before they disappeared into the thicker cover. Once near the crest of the saddle in front of us, we started to take it easy, a few steps at a time, because I expected the deer to be on the other side of the saddle. Sure enough, as I peeked over, I saw a few does. We ducked back down, repositioned up ahead a bit, and then got ready. From where I last saw them feeding, they should feed right out into the open in front of us. The buck would follow the does and bring it right into Nathan's sights. Sure enough, the does started coming into view. We were right there and ready, but with no cover around us, some of the does looked our way and got a little antsy. No matter, as long as the buck followed behind, it was all good. Waiting, we watched as 15 does came into view. You can tell they were a bit spooked by us, but as long as they kept going to the left, the buck would still follow behind them and right into our sights. Funny thing was, it didn't come. We figured the buck must still be just over the rise from us. That being the case, it would be closer if we just hurried up to the top of the saddle with Nathan ready for a quick shot. The does were already spooked anyhow, so it seemed like the best option.
Okay, if it doesn't help, maybe let's hurry up to those rocks. They're already spooked anyways. What do you think? Because it might be down here with another doe or something. Ready? Yeah, take it and go. Must be in front. Hold that. Or it already went around chasing a doe or something. Okay, that was crazy. We know there was a big buck in the group. Got up here and it was all does. So we don't know where that one went.
Well, that was kind of frustrating. I didn't even get footage of the buck because when we saw it from down low, it was so big that there was just no reason to even waste time. It was just, let's get after there and get at it. But I don't know what happened. You know, these bucks, if there's not a doe in heat, a lot of times they'll leave the ones they're with and they'll head off, keep looking. They push does off that are in heat and kind of isolate them sometimes. I don't know, we got up there and there was no buck. We were in perfect position for the herd. All the does came by and there was no buck there. So we're just not quite sure what happened. We hung out, we did a little glassing, never saw a hide nor hair of it. So that's kind of been this hunt. Just the big bucks we do see, they give us the slip, and all the others we just can't see any big bucks. So keep at it. Of course, we kept looking for more deer and did find some that evening. We spotted a couple bucks on the face of a hillside in front of us. Both bucks had about a half a dozen does and were a few hundred yards apart. This first one was a 3-point, but it wasn't really worth more than a second look. As we glanced over to the other herd, the buck running with those does was a 4-point, but it wasn't much bigger than the 3-point we were just watching. We were really getting frustrated that the bucks that we could get into range of were all smaller bucks, while the bigger bucks gave us the slip each time. Of course, it only makes sense that that's how it's going to work out, as the big ones are big for a reason. We sat and glassed the deer for a few minutes and then hurried off. The day was nearly over and the sun had already set. We glassed up a group of does without any bucks and then called it an evening. Of course, we had to empty the loaded muzzleloader, and there was only one way to do that. With the gun clear, we packed up and headed home. So heading back out the next day, we were determined to find that big buck if we could. Driving to the same spot, we didn't spot any deer, so we drove to a little different position a few finger ridges over and did some more glassing, and sure enough, deer started materializing. When I spotted antlers, I started to get excited, but it didn't take long to realize that it wasn't the big one, but rather a younger 4-point. It actually wasn't a bad buck, but it wasn't near the quality of the one we had tried to get on the day before. Surprisingly, there were lots of does with it. We counted about 20 does in all, as well as another small buck. Even though it was near the end of the hunt, it was Nate's call as to whether he would settle on this buck or not.
This is most likely my last day, so I should probably go take that one, but I'm going to risk it and hopefully find a bigger one.
There were a couple other does we'd seen further up the mountain from these deer, and so before we left, we gave them one more look, and suddenly I spotted the big buck bedded up right here. He was a long ways off, and soon after seeing him, he headed into a little pocket of timber. But with any luck, he would bed up in that timber and give us another chance to get in on him.
We changed our angle and we found some more deer, and in those deer is the buck we saw yesterday. That is a definite shooter. So we're going to try a stalk on him and hopefully get him.
Once again, it was going to be a hard hike to get to it. It was about 1,500 feet higher in elevation, so we had some work to do. Like before, we took a route that kept us out of view of where we'd last seen them, and then as we got close to the area we hoped that they'd be in, we slowed up and snuck in. However, the deer were all gone. With a little bit of fresh snow, we picked up their tracks and found they'd fed into a pretty dark and big patch of timber and were on the move. I had an idea of where they were heading, and so we tried to cut them off. However, as we did that, it turned out they beat us to the crossing I had hoped on getting to, and they saw us before we saw them. That, of course, sent them running into the trees, and the day's hunt was over.
Well, we got up there, we're hearing them, kind of see them here and there, and then we spooked them, they disappeared, so all that work for nothing.
Giving the deer a couple days off, we headed back up on the second to last day of the hunt. We had spent so much time on this hunt that it needed to be over. So one way or another, we planned on Nathan taking even a mediocre buck. With that in mind, of course, we went up to where we thought the big buck might be, knowing that there were also some smaller bucks as well. This time, to try to be in position earlier, we didn't even try to spot them from down low. We just hiked on up, hoping the deer would be in the drainage they seemed to like so much.
Hopefully I get them this time.
As we snuck around, we found a few deer, but not the bucks. Then, getting on a good glassing point, I spotted a bedded up buck down below us. Sure enough, it was one of the smaller 4-point bucks we'd seen before. This angle gave us a good view of it and plenty of time for Nate to mull it over whether or not he should take it. We kept our eye out in other directions as well and did find a couple other bucks, but they were even smaller. So turning our attention back to the 4-point, it was time for Nate to get serious about what he was going to do.
Well, we found the buck we saw this morning, and it looks like it was a smaller buck we saw the other day. But we're going to go over and try to get a better look and see if he's a shooter, because it is most likely my last day.
Well, we packed up to go have a look at that buck, and right before we left, I looked back to make sure it was still there, and it was actually up and feeding. And while I was glassing, I spotted another buck. And anyways, I actually think that's the big buck we were really looking for. It just turned out it was bedded up just a little bit. So we'll get the spotting scope on it and have a better look.
By the time I got the scope out, it had also got up and started feeding. Sure enough, as we got a good look at it, it was obviously the bigger buck. On this buck, compared to the others, all the tines were solid tines with good length, and he had good width and was very tall. This was a great mature buck. And to make matters even better, there was a great place to sneak in above the buck about 50 yards. That would be perfect for an open-sighted muzzleloader.
So the other buck is definitely the bigger one that we saw the other day that we've been chasing a couple times. So we're going to drop down. It's in a perfect spot to set right above him. And hopefully it works and we can get him this time.
Swinging around the backside of the ridge it was on, we snuck into the point we had previously decided would be a good point to see it and shoot from. As I peeked through the brush you see in front of me, I was surprised to see the buck happened to be looking my way, and so at only 50 yards, it was staring right at me. Not good. I know you can't see it, but at the drop of a hat, it snorted and jumped up running away from us. Knowing the buck might still give us a shot opportunity, we ran around the point hoping for a miracle. Sure enough, we were able to find them as they were trying to swing around us. At 150 yards, this was still a doable shot.
150, just go dead on him probably. The one that's just coming in the clear. Yeah, the back one. Be nice and steady.
Settling down for the shot, Nate hesitated just a moment to make sure which buck was the big one, and by the time he was on it, it didn't hold still long enough for Nate to feel like he had a good shot. And I'll tell you what, it was tough to watch him drop into that ravine without a shot being fired. As soon as they were out of sight, though, it was off to the races again. Once again, we were able to get to that 150-yard shot position. This time, they slowly worked out of a draw and in our sights. Nate put the bead on the buck and squeezed the trigger.
Get another one. Just wait, don't move much though.
Do you think it'll still work?
Just try it. I guess, I don't know what. No, it went, so it probably won't. I can't believe that.
What you just heard was the cap going off, but not the charge. A misfire. This is what muzzleloader hunters have nightmares about having, and here it happened right when Nate finally had a shot at a fantastic buck.
That one?
Well, at this point, there wasn't much we could do but sit back and watch. They slowed down and started feeding a long ways off in the distance, but we were caught out in the open and couldn't move for fear of spooking them again. So we just hung out until they once again bedded up, which was probably an hour and a half or two later. So now with them bedded up high on the next ridge over, we dropped down and then hiked back up to give this one more try. Sneaking over a rock ledge, we found the two bucks. Sure enough, they were still where we'd last seen them. As you can see, they're bedded up, but still at 200 yards. We needed to get closer. We dropped just a little bit back and then crawled up to the next spot we had in mind. This put us closer, and both bucks were none the wiser. The only problem was, all we could see were their heads and antlers. Definitely not a good shot with a muzzleloader. This would have to be a waiting game. Eventually they'd get up and feed, and when they did, Nate would be ready. First, Nathan tried to position himself on the rocks, but he just couldn't find a good spot. So then we pulled out the tripod shooting sticks I got at the Army Surplus Warehouse. This allowed Nate to get really good and stable. And then, of course, it was back to waiting. By now it was 2 p.m., which doesn't sound that late, but with it getting dark at 5, that meant that most deer would be getting up and feeding within the next hour. We waited and waited and waited some more. Meanwhile, it was snowing off and on us, making for a cold wait. I'll tell you what, watching this buck for so long at such close range didn't help quell the excitement both of us had. All we needed for him to do was stand up.
Well, it's freezing right now. We're getting snowed on like crazy. These bucks just won't get up. They better hurry. We can't take this much longer.
Finally, after what I'd guessed to be an hour and a half or so of waiting, it suddenly stood up. First, after all that snow, it had to shake it off. I'm not sure about you, but I really enjoyed that video footage. Now if it would just turn broadside, Nate had a bead on it and was steady as a rock. Perfect. Just as we wanted, it started to turn broadside. That pop you just heard was another cap that fired but didn't ignite the powder charge. We both went sick to our stomachs, realizing what just happened. The buck, meanwhile, didn't even hear the cap. Apparently the wind was in our favor. so it just kind of looked around for a bit and then started feeding. There wasn't a lot we could do, but inside we were panicking, and then the other buck stood up and started feeding. Neither one of them knew we were there yet, so maybe there was still hope. We knew that after 2 caps had failed to ignite the charge, that either we had a plug nipple or the powder was wet, so it wasn't worth trying another cap. As the deer fed off out of sight, Nate dropped down to his pack and grabbed the tools, and we cleaned out the gun. That meant pushing out the bullet, all the powder, the nipple, everything.
Well, you can imagine how frustrating that is after we sat here, froze our butts off and waited, and finally stood up at the perfect shot. Click. They didn't spook out. They kind of fed over the ridge, so we took the gun apart, cleaned it, and reloaded it. So we just don't know if we can get back in on them, if they're still there or not. So we're going to sneak over, and hopefully they're just around the corner.
First, we found the 4 does that were with the 2 bucks, and they were just over 100 yards off, but we couldn't find the bucks. Then I spotted some deer a long ways off, and putting the spotting scope to them, sure enough found that it was the same 2 bucks. In the half hour we'd spent cleaning and reloading the gun, they'd covered some country. Because the does were between us, we couldn't go straight at them. We had to try to backtrack about a half mile and then go back up the draw they were now in. With only an hour of light left, we had to move fast. Frustratingly though, by the time we got there, they were gone.
Well, that was a kick in the shorts there. That's 3 different times we tried to get in on him this last time. Because of the lack of daylight, we had to really push hard, and got up here and he was gone. He had moved, probably about a half mile, but it took about a mile worth of walking. After that, the cap that didn't go off, or the powder that was too wet, or whatever it was, that was so frustrating. This buck is he's got us. He schooled us again today. 3 times. So we might have to come back tomorrow, the last day of the hunt. It means Nathan will miss another day of school. I'm sure he'll be disappointed, but we gotta come after him.
Tune in next week at the same time for another episode of Jared Scott Outdoors.